Good afternoon. I wanted to do this video during the May Day long weekend, and I hope you're having a good holiday. In this video, I want to talk about two issues which I believe are important and have been the subject of debate, not just over the last few years, but as long as I can remember. One of them concerns the whole question of the public debt. Public debt has been a recurring political issue on the agenda of all political parties, certainly over the last 34 to 35 years. It has occupied much political coverage, both in the written media and indeed in Parliament during this period of time. I am not here to talk about or indeed attempt to debate the subject matter at a political level. I am not a politician and I will allow our politicians to do that. No doubt the subject will play out in parliamentary debate, including in the next budget session. But certainly, if I can go back in time, as I have done on the occasions that I have either appeared on GBC or indeed when I have recorded a video, and this is my third political video. What I do is I turn to the past because the past, I think, is an important reference point for any discussion with regards to the present and indeed the future. 1988, I think, is an important political reference point. In 1988, the GSLP was elected into government. The GSLP, as I have pointed out in previous recordings, embarked on the largest reclamation Gibraltar has ever seen. That happened in 1988, 1989. The GSLP government also embarked on the largest infrastructural project Gibraltar has ever seen, and indeed the biggest social housing program in the history of Gibraltar. Clearly, in order to grow our economy and at the same time implement and undertake those initiatives, the government had to borrow money. I remember that in the early 90s, the government of Gibraltar borrowed an amount of £100 million. They did so by raising and issuing a bond in the bond markets at that time. Criticism was leveled at the government at the time by the then ACR opposition. I remember this clearly. I was a young man at the time, on the basis that the government was mortgaging our children's future. That was the very clear political criticism that was directed at the government at the time. Had we or had the government at the time not borrowed the amount of money, then clearly much of what we take for granted today wouldn't have happened. So there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that criticism directed at that government was misguided criticism. It wasn't the first time or the last time that criticism was directed at the government of Gibraltar. I remember also when Peter Caruana was elected into government in 1996, much of the focus of his government over the next two terms in office was the development of the financial services industry and investment into the economy of Gibraltar. I also remember in the early 2000s when I admit I expressed questions around whether or not the government of Gibraltar was borrowing too much money. And I did express views to that effect. Well, quite frankly, I was clearly wrong, and I was not the only one to have directed that criticism at the then government. The point I am clearly trying to make is that criticism of governments with regards to the borrowing of money is not new. That criticism has been taking place over a long period of time, and indeed continues to be the focal point for political challenge by the current opposition parties. I guess if you raise enough questions and enough challenge over a period of 34 to 35 years, at some point, clearly, it could become a matter of political concern. There's nothing new about this criticism. The difference, I suppose, is that today Gibraltar faces challenges that are external to the political situation that we are living in Gibraltar. Not only have we faced Brexit, which was the biggest political and economic challenge Gibraltar has ever faced, but over the last 2 years, we know, and we have all lived this intensively, that Gibraltar has had to face a pandemic that has had huge economic consequences for this community. Over the last few months, we have also seen how the conflict in Ukraine has created much economic uncertainty, not just for Gibraltar, but indeed for the whole world. We have seen the inflationary pressures in particular, and that is something that will bite in to most economies, and Gibraltar clearly is not immune. Any one of these posed an existential threat for Gibraltar. Brexit, COVID, and indeed the conflict in Ukraine that could develop into a much more serious military conflict than what we are seeing today. God forbid, but that clearly is always a possibility. So any one of these could have posed a serious existential threat for Gibraltar. We in Gibraltar and the government has had to face all three threats together, simultaneously, all at the same time. Clearly that has an economic impact on our community. I believe that the government of Gibraltar has handled our affairs in these three areas extremely well over the last 3 to 4 years. And I commend the government, and I've said it publicly. Just as an anecdote, 7 years ago, I wrote an essay, an article where I postulated that, or rather I postulated what would it take for civilization to decline? What would it take for civilization to be facing an existential threat? And I pointed out that a pandemic and the spread of regional wars would be something that could have certainly that impact. That doesn't make me Nostradamus. Clearly what I attempted to do was to consider what were the high impact events that could have such a political and social impact across the world. And there were clearly those two high impact events, a pandemic or the spread of regional conflicts. Well, over the last 2 years, we have seen two of those, and two that have had a significant impact in Gibraltar. So I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the political arguments around, how large is that debt and who bears political responsibility for that. I'm sure that our politicians will do that much better than I, and certainly it will become the subject of debate at the next budget session. My point is that criticism is not new, that criticism has been taking place for as long as I can remember, and that every opposition party has leveled the same criticism at the government of Gibraltar. The other point I really wanted to raise today, because I think it is of fundamental importance, is the whole question of political unity. I have on a number of occasions in social media called for a degree of political unity in Gibraltar. My intention in so doing is not to stifle political debate. Far from it. I have dedicated much of my career to the advancement of education, and indeed in trying to challenge others, and indeed to challenge myself and to stimulate intellectual debate and discussion wherever I thought it was necessary. And that is something that I will never stop doing. However, Gibraltar today faces a series of events which are external to Gibraltar, as I have highlighted, that I think warrants a level of political parties working together in the best interest of Gibraltar. That does not mean that political parties should not challenge the government of Gibraltar. Far from it. I am a strong believer in parliamentary scrutiny and indeed in the fact that in any credible democracy you need a strong opposition. I am also a strong believer that conflict remains the basis for much of the advancement that we have achieved, not just in Gibraltar, but indeed the world over. Political conflict and conflict in society is necessary for the advancement of many of the things that we now take for granted. Without conflict, we wouldn't have had democracy. Without conflict, we wouldn't have had much of the civil rights that we take for granted today, or indeed human rights. Human rights are inherently based on history and a history based on conflict. And therefore, I am not suggesting for one moment that political parties should not challenge each other. They should. But in Gibraltar, we are a very small community, and in my view, at this critical point in our history, we should be working much more together for the common good and a common purpose. I think that is something that is critical and important, and it's a debate, certainly, which is worth having. Ironically, many of our leading politicians and political players in Gibraltar have at some stage in their history worked together politically. There have also been politicians today that at some stage were opposed politically to each other, and as a result of political realignment, they have decided also to work together in the best interest of their political objectives. Now, I think that politicians and political parties today should work for a common good, and that common good must be whatever is in the best interest of this community. Really, those are the 2 points that I wanted to talk about. To the extent that they are relevant, no doubt, it will promote further discussion and further debate. I hope that you are having a good, long weekend, whatever you're doing. So thank you very much for listening to this video, and no doubt at some point I will be back for more. Thank you.